1885. I wasn't looking for giants. I was looking at old newspapers, the kind printed on paper so thin you're afraid to breathe near it. Columns packed tight with ink. Rail schedules, local elections, livestock prices, ordinary American life, documented one day at a time. I was tracing county land records through microfilm archives when something small caught my eye. 4 paragraphs. Published in a regional Ohio paper. A skeleton unearthed during a canal excavation. Just over 7 feet long, bones described as unusually thick, the skull unusually large. The article treated it the way you might treat a barn fire. Matter of fact. Uneventful. Ordinary. That's what made me stop. Not the size, the tone. There was no amazement, no spectacle, no exclamation point. It was written like a weather update. It happened. Here are the details. Moving on. And for some reason, that felt wrong. So I looked for another. And I found one. Then another. Between 1870 and 1915, reports of enormous human skeletons appeared regularly in mainstream American newspapers. Not once. Not twice. Not a handful of isolated oddities. Regularly. Exposed during railroad construction, farming excavation, municipal building projects, riverbank erosion, found in burial mounds, in stone-lined graves, in arranged formations that showed clear signs of intention. Some reports ran in the New York Times, others in well-known regional papers across Indiana, West Virginia, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Tennessee, and the Dakotas. These weren't tabloids. These were the same publications reporting presidential campaigns and congressional legislation. And yet the contents describe something that, by modern understanding, shouldn't exist. Skeletons 7 feet tall, 8 feet, occasionally 9. In a few cases, measurements at 10 or even 11 feet. Accompanied by copper artifacts, oversized weaponry, carved stone tablets, shell beads in quantities suggesting trade networks. Sometimes physicians were called to examine the remains. County officials recorded measurements. The reporting is specific, anatomical, calm. Which raises the first real question. Why was this normal? If a 9-foot skeleton were uncovered tomorrow in rural Ohio, it would dominate global headlines within hours. Universities would mobilize. Federal agencies would respond. Every camera in the country would point at that excavation site. And yet, a century ago, it was column filler. The 4 paragraphs between a church social and a grain report. That leaves 2 possibilities. Either dozens of newspapers across multiple states fabricated stories consistently for nearly 50 years without contradiction. Or the discoveries weren't astonishing to them. Both are uncomfortable. At first, the reports are almost explainable. The 1870s and early 1880s cluster around skeletons in the 7-foot range. Tall, certainly. Above average in an era when most men stood around 5'7", but biologically possible. You can rationalize that. Then the numbers rise. By the late 1880s and 1890s, 8 feet appears more often. Then 9. Descriptions become more detailed. Broad shoulders, thick femurs, heavy brow ridges, mandibles nearly twice the width of a typical adult male. These aren't vague exaggerations. They're anatomical notes, and the burial context matters. The skeletons aren't scattered randomly. They're arranged. Radial formations, organized mounds, deliberate placement. Artifacts appear again and again, copper breastplates, mica ornaments, stone pipes, tools larger than standard regional examples. It starts to look less like a curiosity, more like a pattern. And then something shifts. Around 1910, the frequency slows. By 1915, noticeably thinner. By 1920, Nothing. Then, silence. No debunking campaign, no wave of corrections, no editorials apologizing for past errors. The articles simply stop. That's where it gets strange, because the skeletons weren't the only thing that vanished. Late 19th and early 20th century reports frequently mention remains being forwarded to institutions, state historical societies, and universities. The Smithsonian Institution is referenced by name in multiple accounts. Crates shipped to Washington, measurements recorded, catalog entries noted. The expectation was preservation. So where are they? Researchers have asked. Formal inquiries have been filed. Requests submitted for catalog references matching the original reports. In most cases, the response is consistent. No records found. No matching entries. No remains in storage. I'm not claiming destruction. I'm not claiming deliberate erasure. But there is a gap. A documented gap between what newspapers reported in real time and what institutions acknowledge today. Records can be lost. Collections mismanaged. Floods happen. Labels fade. But this isn't one specimen. It mirrors the reporting pattern almost perfectly. And patterns matter. Here's another one. Around the same decades, these skeletons were being reported. Something else was being built. Courthouses, state capitals, federal buildings, administrative centers. Many share a feature that becomes impossible to ignore once you see it. The doors are enormous. Not just the grand entrances, those make sense. The interior doors, utility corridors, service hallways, 12-foot doors inside non-public spaces, 14 and 15-foot ceilings in areas never meant for spectacle, staircases scaled larger than necessary, original furniture built at proportions that feel slightly off. Architects will say it's aesthetic language, neoclassical proportion, grandeur. That explains the rotunda. But why the storage hallway? Why scale interior spaces for occupants that, according to the official record, didn't exist? I don't have an answer, but I notice the overlap. Same decades, same regions, and it's not confined to America. Russia, Central Asia, parts of Europe, reports of unusually large skeletal remains during roughly the same period. Organized burials, large stature, accompanying artifacts, and they stop in the same window. Different governments, different languages, same silence. That's hard to ignore. I've tried to find a simple explanation, a hoax trend, a journalistic fashion that expired, a measurement error corrected by improved science. I've looked for that thread. I haven't found it. So I started thinking about something else. Memory. We assume forgetting is passive, that things just fade. But forgetting often has structure. Sometimes it's suppression. Sometimes it's neglect. Sometimes it's reclassification. What was once fact becomes folklore. Folklore becomes myth. Myth becomes nonsense. And eventually, it becomes something that was never said at all. That doesn't require villains, just time and silence. Is erasure loud, or is it quiet? If someone had mentioned giant skeletons in American newspapers before you watched this, what would your reaction have been? Dismissal, probably, because there's no framework left for it. It appears in no textbook, no curriculum, no museum display. But it was printed, front page, between grain prices and weather forecasts, and no one thought it needed explanation, until everyone forgot. The tone still bothers me, that calm, unexcited reporting voice. It suggests that the information fit within their understanding of reality. It didn't need drama. It wasn't extraordinary to them. We live in a different framework now, where the same information feels impossible, not disproven, just outside the boundary. And once something moves outside the boundary, it doesn't get argued against. It gets ignored. But the clean cut remains the strangest part. Not a fade, a synchronized stop across continents within roughly a decade. Whatever changed, changed everywhere. 1885, an excavation crew in the Ohio River Valley uncovers a mound. 7 skeletons arranged in a radial pattern. The smallest at 7 feet 2 inches, the largest just under 9. Copper ornaments on their chests. The paper runs it on page 1. No outrage, no ridicule, just documentation. Then, silence. I don't know what was buried in those mounds. I don't know what was sent to those institutions. I don't know whether answers were hidden or simply lost, but I know the articles exist. They're archived, searchable, still sitting in the same columns where they were first printed. Ordinary reporters describing what they saw. The question that stays with me isn't whether the skeletons were real. It's this. What kind of system makes an entire culture forget what it once considered ordinary? And how would you know if that system was still operating? Maybe the strangest part isn't that they were reported. Maybe it's how easily they were forgotten.